timing game, man. So stressful. 11. Hey, look, it's 11:15.
Oh no! Wait.
The clock.
Yeah.
Or not 11. What do I do? It's like 4:15.
6? Wait,
6?
which is the
5?
small hand?
I think 5. 6 is straight down, right? Shit, I haven't looked at an
6 is
analog
straight
clock
down.
in
Yeah,
10
yeah.
years. It's so hard to remember.
Yeah, 6 is straight down.
Okay.
So that's like probably like
Wait, that
1:30?
time doesn't really make
1:30?
sense, does it?
yeah, that's like 1:30.
Oh, yeah, shorthand. Okay, yeah, I have the shorthand and the longhand reversed. Yeah, that makes sense. It's 1:30.
I assume it's either 1:30 or it's like 6:15
Who knows?
or 6:05.
Dude, that's such a weird thing. It's like a kind of hacky joke that I hear these days. That you hear people talk about people like not being able to read clocks. It reminds me like when we were younger, you would hear people talk about like people not being able to read maps anymore, which
Yeah.
I think is quite funny. I always had a good laugh at that of like, kids these days probably can't even read a map. Like, dude, it's a fucking everyone can read it's a map. It's got roads on it, north, south, east, west. Like, that's a skill that you can literally obtain like the first time you need it. You can just look at it for a while and figure it out. So the guy I always thought was funny. So I used to get a lot of yucks out of that, like older folks talking about people not being able to read maps anymore. But nowadays I hear it's clocks. People are like, oh, kids these days probably don't even know how to read an analog clock. Yeah, probably not, dude. No one's needed that. I haven't seen an analog clock in a decade. Like, it's been a long fucking time since I've seen one like anywhere. That's must be an exaggeration, but like you see them so rarely in any place. Like, it's a completely antiquated skill. But much like a map, it's something you can just look at and you'll figure it the fuck out. It's not complicated. There's no specialty skill.
Yeah, probably. It's weird because I've had a run-in with this just in high school. In high school, I knew a girl. I actually knew 2 girls. They were twins. And they did not know how to read an analog clock. And we were in class one day, and someone was like, "What time?" They were like, "What time is it?" And everyone's like, "I mean, just look at the clock." And they're like, they just froze. And then eventually they were like, "We don't know how to read a clock."
That's so bizarre to me. That has to. Okay. Maybe I'm overstepping, but there's got to be some part of that that's like a little bit willful, right? You have to be like,
Yeah.
I don't need that skill. I'm not gonna learn it. Cause like it.
But isn't that like the same idea?
I suppose that's true, but like
the idea of the younger generation not being able to, not necessarily being that they're incapable of learning, but just that they aren't learning it.
Maybe that's true, but I feel like the only way for that to have like teeth, to have it like gravity, is if it's referring to something that a skill you need for something. Like when people say like you can't read a map, it's like, yeah, you're gonna get lost. Like you can't read a clock, you won't know what time it is. But that's predicated on the idea that if you were in a situation where it's like, you need to know what time it is, and there's only an analog clock, and it's like, I don't know what this situation is, but let's just say that happened, right? There was like a crazed killer and he had a gun to your head, and he's like, you're gonna die unless you can tell me what time it is. If you looked at it for a minute, it's a pretty self-explanatory situation, right? There's 2 hands. One of them is pointing at a small number and one's pointing at a big number. As long as you have a basic concept of the 12-hour cycle, like maybe if you were in a dark room and you didn't know if it was AM or PM, I guess, but an analog clock doesn't tell you that. Like, I feel like if you spent the time with it, you would figure it out. You might get it reversed once, but like a cursory logic would probably tell you. Yeah, if you couldn't see outside, so you didn't know if it was day or night, you might be like, I don't know, it's like it's either 8:15 or like 1:45. I don't know that that's a totally solvent comparison, but you know what I mean. You might read the hands backwards at worst, but it's the same thing with like reading a map where like you might get a little lost like with the interstate numbers at first, but like if you had a few minutes, you wouldn't starve to death on the side of the road. You'd figure it out. It's just like a funny thing to me. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's also I find it I think it's interesting that people criticize people for not having a skill that has very little like consistent value, like something you almost never need, like not knowing how to use a rotary phone. Like, you got me. I mean I do, but that's only because I've watched old TV. But if I didn't, you know. Not really a critical skill. If I die not because I don't know how to use a rotary phone, fair play. I'll eat all these words and then some. You can come to my funeral and talk shit all day, but I'm willing to make that bet. I'm pretty fucking confident that that's not going to be how I go down.
I think part of that probably then comes from that it's a skill that the older generation needed.
Yeah.
Like
so it's
yeah.
Yeah, it like seems important.
Yeah.
I mean, that's fair. It's not to say that it never mattered, but
yeah.
You get what I'm saying. I think I just kind of take umbrage with people having that idea that if people don't do things the way they had to do them, then it's like somehow of lower quality.
Yeah.
Like, you didn't have to work as hard as I did, so your efforts are somehow less valid. Yeah. Is a very silly way to... It seems like a grumpy way to be.
Yeah.
It reminds me of like, you don't really meet these people that often in real life. They're more like a fabled people, but they're out there. People who like need games to have been beaten on a difficulty, or like, oh, you beat that, but did you 100% it? Or like,
yeah,
did you beat X game? Yeah, but like, what was your build? Oh, you did it the easy way. It's like, gee, eat my ass, dude. I don't care. Fuck you forever. And I look back and I'm like, I definitely, when I was younger, had those moments. It's easy to look back and see where that came from when you had like a really hard time with something that someone else breezed through. But like, it's juvenile. I did it because I was juvenile. Like, there was nothing courageous about it. I don't know. Just a funny thing. Quite humorous.
Yeah, and there is that part of like someone did it to me, so like
yeah, I get to kick it back at people now.
Yeah.
That's if there's what's it called? You know where, like, I think
self-imposed hazing in a way.
Self-imposed, yeah, like sort of exclusionary. You know where I think that comes from? Maybe I'm just kind of like hazarding a guess based on my own experiences, but I think there's some heart of that comes from the time when a lot of those endeavors, like video games mostly, but a lot of like games and kind of nerdy endeavors were very niche, and so you sort of like, what's the right word? It was like yours. You know what I mean? It wasn't that long ago, even kind of when we were young, which is not a terribly long time ago, like D&D wasn't a game that everybody played. It was a small community, and we're not. I grew up in like the ass end of 3rd edition, so that's not even like the real old school D&D people who were fucking like mystery folk that had rumors about that. You know what I mean? It was like a whole nother cultural thing then, but like, and like video games and things were something that was kind of personal. It was like a little bit yours. And so you sort of felt like almost a little intruded upon when someone like really casually like gets into like when somebody is able to get into the thing that you had as like an escape or an outlet that like you went through because you had something, some part of you in your life and things that led you to that moment where this hobby was there for you in like an emotional way, and then somebody else is like, oh yeah, I did that too, and it's like nothing to them. It almost hurts a little bit. And you feel like you want to be like, yeah, but like it was real for me, and it almost like loses some of it because it wasn't real for them. Sort of personal thing. I don't know. I with a lot of like there's it's hard. It's a very different world we live in now than we did, a couple of decades ago when like, nerd culture wasn't mainstream. It's like a lot of big changes.
Same thing can be said of like a lot of cultures that are kind of like now mainstream or becoming mainstream, and it's like, it's the younger generation has it easier. Like, not as like a way to like put them down, but it's like
they legitimately have easier access to things.
Someone helped pave that way, right?
Yeah.
Someone helped put in that work and like pave that way, and it's like I feel it as a nerd sometimes because where like when I was younger, like I got bullied and picked on, and like I had like bullies like grab my I'd be playing cards with my friends and they would grab my cards and just like throw them and stuff like that. I had to deal with like that actual like being made fun of just for being a nerd,
dude.
And then like I look around school, like I look at schools now, and it's like, oh, like being a nerd is just like it is now. So much more acceptable.
Yeah.
It's.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question on that subject?
Go ahead.
Our audience has never seen you in person. So as far as I know, at what point in your life did the switch click where you're like, oh, if somebody pushes my shit onto the ground, I can put them in the dirt? When did that occur to you that you're like, oh, I actually don't have to take any shit from anyone?
A lot of that more came from just like a breaking point of just being an angry child. Eventually being pushed to the point of like, oh yeah, I can beat it. A lot of it actually came from just being a young boy, and like when we didn't have much to do, sometimes like the game was like, let's just wrestle, like let's just fight, that's what we're gonna do for fun right now. And it was more of the point when I would start like wrestling with my friends and I would like start beating them, that it became more of a thing of like, oh, I know how strong that person is. And,
you get a sense of like what you're capable of.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
And then there's just like moments where it's just like, oh, hey, I realize like I have a higher pain tolerance than some other people, or like
yeah, it is like
stuff like that.
It's a funny thing. It's a very specialized skill being able to like size somebody up and like know if you can beat them. And it's not one that I have by any means, but some people just do. But it's something you only learn from like a lot of sort of physical situations, I suppose. So I was gonna say, still on kind of the subject of like nerd culture. There is a part of me that does sort of lament. I don't know. Maybe this is true for kind of all things as they stop being niche and they pick up like broad appeal. You know what I mean? It can be kind of devastating when when things are small and niche. They don't have to be good for anybody but the people they're meant for, right? Like they're just it's a thing for the people who love it, and that's all. When things start to get popular in a big way, you have to kind of keep adding water to it, and eventually you end up, with the Avengers, and it's just like, there's no more broth, it's all water now, there's no meat in this stew.
Yeah.
And you kind of like keep widening your audience, and I think when you look at
why
Dungeon...
is Led Zeppelin playing during Thor? I don't know.
Yeah, like what the hell? How in the world is fucking Alex Jones playing the White Stripes? Like what? It's just so weird. Anyway, what was I gonna say? Just like as things shift like that, it's interesting when you look at D&D. You can chart its success along with like a significant part of it is, of course, people who play D&D being sort of out and proud about it. We started to see more and more people be like, yeah, I play D&D, that's normal. Like I remember when people used to like, dude, did you know Vin Diesel plays D&D? And like that was news. Like anyone gave a shit that was like a real thing. It's just like, it was weird at the time, and now you look at it and you're like, yeah, people play D&D, it's not like a huge deal, it's kind of normal. And that kind of stuff really paved the way. But at the same time, you can look at the way the game is played and look through the editions and see like 2nd edition when it was it was a hobbyist's hobby. It was something you had to be really into, and the game played like a game you had to be really into.
Yeah, it played like a game that you had to want to play.
Yeah. And like 3rd edition came, and like we saw all this I'm not going to get too much into like D&D mechanics, but like, it's like quality of life things changed. As much as we look back at 3rd edition, you're like, man, this game's fucking accounting, it's hardcore. And then you look at 2nd edition, you're like, nope, I had no idea what I was getting into. I was playing the easy game. And then
one of my favorites is at the start of the second edition Advanced Player's Guide. It literally starts off by being like, this is to make a bunch of quality of life changes over first edition.
Yeah.
Like,
hey, imagine.
Yeah.
Imagine. That's the easy one.
Second edition, yeah, they were like, yeah, we realized that some people, don't like doing as much math, so we're gonna do some of that math for you. And it's like, but it's still so much math.
It's wild. But it's funny. As it's gone on, then we hit. This is a nightmare, by the way. I just want to say this is weirdly might be the most stressful screen so far. What was it say? As it's become something that like everybody can do, it's also become a game that everyone can play, which is very like different. It's cool. I'm 100% for it. I love that it went that way. But there are moments even in my own where I'm looking at D&D stuff and I'm like, man, you lost your edge right there. Like they're as much as you would never think of D&D as like edgy. In the context of fantasy, there were a lot of places where it did have kind of those teeth. And there's stuff that people just like I don't want to say accept now, but things that are just like really different from what people sought in fantasy. What people look for in a D&D game is so different. I don't know. It's an odd point, but
yeah. So I think in that same vein,
I just figured out what you have to do here. Jesus Christ. But yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So in that same vein, oh god, where was I gonna go with that? Oh, did I do it?
Oh, I think it's a little low. Oh, you nailed it! You fucking beast.
So
go.
So
no time to think. You gotta play. There is no downtime. There is only Celeste.
So a good example of that is like grabbing, right? Like.
Grappling?
Yeah, grappling.
Truly the bastard child of Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah. Any D&D fans out there, you either went, huh? Or, nah. And you're both right.
But yeah, it's like, grappling used to be like the problem that they experienced with grappling was like they made it so crunchy and like so overly convoluted in 3.5, but like it worked, it functioned, it did the thing that you wanted it to do, but it just required so much more work. Whereas now it's like 5th edition, they're like, oh, they watered it down a lot to make it more.
But now it's not fun.
Yeah, now it just like doesn't function really.
What a great, actually, yeah, thank you for that. That is a great way to bring this whole conversation down into one fucking mechanic. Yeah, it's D&D is grappling. Is it better to have something that is extremely fun to do, but is so complicated that only a couple of people can do it, or that anyone can do, but is kind of joyless?
Yeah,
that's a tough line to walk. But yeah, D&D is like a good example. But yeah, just like everything else, like nerd culture stuff, like you can't make really controversial comic books anymore, really, if you're a mainstream company. Like if you're a writer and you're like, oh man, I have this really interesting kind of crazy story I want to tell, you can't, kind of. You have to live in a very different world if you want to. If you're like, yeah, I have this like wild Batman story, I'd love it to do like this. You know, if you got a chance to write Batman, you are not writing anything that isn't exactly what DC wants Batman to look like and be like, unless they're doing like a publicity gimmick. Marvel the same way, of course.
There has actually been a big exodus of like comic book writers switching to like Kickstarted and Patreon.
Yeah, dude. It's
like,
the fucking best.
Their own like indie publishing companies.
I am so excited to see that of this. It's this whole new fucking world of people just going like, fuck it, I'm just gonna write my own story. Yeah, indie comics are where it's at if you're a comic book reader now.
Yeah, it's funny. Having worked in comic books like the past year, indie is so much more popular than it used to be. A lot of people have started like leaving DC. There's not as many DC readers. There's a lot of there's still a lot of people reading Marvel. Marvel still does okay. But fucking DC, man, DC has slowly just like removed a lot of their other comics, and so much of it is just saturated, just Batman.
Yeah,
just Batman and the Batman verse and Gotham. It's I call DC Gotham verse now because
that's a great way to describe it.
Because that's just what it's become. Like you look, we we were playing a game one day where we're like, all right, how many DC comics can you count on the shelf that are new comics
that don't have Batman?
That aren't related, that aren't Batman comics, and or aren't Gotham comics. And so like to make it easier, we made it just Batman comics.
Just to get some numbers on the board.
Yeah. And even then, like literally like current ongoing titles, there was like 9 Batman titles. Like nine Batman titles.
They fucking know where their bread is buttered, that's for sure. Fucking hell.